Alright, I'll get to what I'm doing in a minute, but I wanted to show you this first. I'm trying to create a derived grandson class from the son class up here. And I'm trying to create a default constructor for it, as you can see, but it's giving me an error saying no default constructor exists for class son. So I need to create one. Let me get rid of this. Actually, there's probably some reason put that in there. Okay, but let's create a default constructor. What the fuck is this stupid IntelliSense doing, piece of shit? Anyway, yeah, that did fix it, so this fucking IntelliSense is misbehaving again. Alright, what I'm demonstrating with this little program, and I'll show you the code a little bit in a second. Let me get this out of the way. Is this is a constructor call chain. Okay, so when you're dealing with inheritance, the first constructor it calls is the parent constructor, then it calls, the first derived class constructor. If you look at this, since this is the grandson class down here, this is what this is based on. It shows that it starts with the parent, the base class constructor, then the first derived class, and the next derived class. So that's the chain of constructors. Now, when calling destructors, I think it works in reverse. So, and I was talking about this on another video, but this shows you the call chain of it. So if you go down here, you can see what I'm doing with the main function. All I'm doing is instantiating a daughter, then a son, and then a grandson. That's all I'm doing, and then I'm just outputting these messages. These messages are pretty much defined in the classes. So you can see we got our parent class, which we don't have an instance of. I could call make an instance of the parent class, but that wasn't in the book. But we have a constructor in it, which is a default constructor, and then we have a parent, which takes a parameter. Another constructor, a parent, which takes a parameter. So we're overloading the constructor. So you can see overloaded parent called, and then I actually take that parameter and add 9 to it, whatever it is. But then we have our default constructor, which doesn't accept any parameters for input. Okay, then I derive, in the daughter class here, we derive from the parent. Okay, and the daughter, has her default constructor, and basically displays this message. And then we define a son, which is also based on the parent class, or derived from the parent class, that it, has a parametric input on it. And you can see that both, since that is parametric, apparently it calls the derived class and its parametric value too. is what it does. Although I don't think that's necessary, and I'm going to demonstrate that with our grandson class here in a second, because we have a default class on the grandson, and you can see what the grandson is calling. It's calling its default constructor, then the default constructor for the son class, and the default parent class constructor. Okay, whereas the son class, fully is the son, and as you can see defined down here, is calling, like you can see up here, is calling not only the son's class, but the overloaded class, but also the parent's overloaded class too. But in the son class, that's why I had to add earlier in the video son class constructor, because it didn't have a default constructor with it, so there's nothing to pass variables into, because default constructor should always be defined whenever you're defining a class. If you're going to mess with constructors and destructors, but you should also always have destructors defined too, because this doesn't have a default constructor, because they work in pairs. So if you create a custom constructor, well then, it'll not use the built-in default constructor, but it also won't use the built-in default destructor either, I don't think. At least that's my understanding of it. But you should always, create these in pairs, basically, even though you usually don't do anything with the destructor. At least it's good practice to do that anyway. Again, I don't know if it's absolutely necessary, but it's good practice. Even if you're not going to do anything with it. So, we could create, for example, a default son destructor here and not really do anything with it. So, like I said, IntelliSense is acting up on me, fucking piece of shit. But, again, I don't think you really need to put any code in it. But that takes care of it. I don't know if that was appropriate, though, for me to do that. Put a semicolon there in that case. But I guess I need to rerun the code at this point. I'll put a message in here anyway. God damn it. Fucking IntelliSense. Anyway. Alright, so I, got the son's constructor class, and I'll show you it does actually call it. At first, I'm going to deal with the grandson. Now, the grandson, I went and defined, this overloaded class, which I think we did before, I'm not sure. But, let's see. Now, but at any rate, I've created these constructors here, and let's just run it and see what it does. Okay. Now you can see here, just like before, it was calling, the daughter's class, now the son's class, now the grandson's class, just like before. And but then we've done an overloaded constructor for the grandson. Which you can see here, it just accepts an integer, and it's overloading, its default constructor is what I mean by overloaded. But then we got this, construct function 2, and that's being called down here. We're passing 2 variables into it. Okay, and you can see that again, first the parent default constructor is called, then the son's derived constructor is called, because look at the format. Okay, and then overloaded function of, but then this constructor is called basically. So you can see what parameters we're passing in. And this is the only way to overload, by the way, functions in general, not just constructors, but they've got to differ in parameters or types. Now I could have, instead of making these integers, I could have made like one of them float, or could have made that integer, this one float, and so forth, and that counts as a different type, and a different one character, etc. And then just had one variable for each parameter, but I decided to pass in 2 variables just to differentiate it, so it doesn't, there's just no ambiguity in what I mean when I pass 2 variables in. But the same, if I had an int version and a float version and a character version, there'd be no ambiguity either, even if they just had one variable in it, even if it was the same variable name, because this is just temporary. It's within the scope of this function that variable a, this integer a, exists. But when we get to the third constructor that I was trying to define, because I was trying to see if like the sun chain, how that did this little thing here, which I commented out, by the way. Just temporarily, which I forgot to uncomment it really. But I commented it out to try to see if I can get this to work, because I was trying to see if I could actually call a chain. But then I realized that, oh well, maybe the problem is that I have a chain here defined. But no, that's not the problem. The thing is, you just can't define these in any way. Originally I had comma parent here, but but the point is that it looks like you can only do that one deep. If you want to call, because like I said up here, we call, this constructor, okay, with a variable passed into it, but then it just calls the son's constructor by default, because we're passing in 88 to it. Okay, it just calls the son's default constructor and then the parent's class's default constructor. Now I was trying to see if I could actually call the overloaded constructors of all classes, and I can't do it. I can just simply call the son's constructor like I did here, but I can't call the son and parent's overloaded constructors. So that only works basically one layer deep, one layer below, one inheritance layer deep. So so that just I kind of learned something there. Let me go show you the destructor in operation. Son's destructor called, son's destructor called, son's destructor called, and it keeps getting called because of all the objects I created and so forth, I think. Because I created a lot of son and grandson objects here. So, the son's destructor, I put a system pause so you could see it. Because otherwise it's only called once you hit that space bar or whatever, press any key. So, but anyway, let me go real quick and set this back to rights. back to how it was by default. Okay, so let's see if that caused any problems or not. No default constructor exists for Sun, so it's, wait a minute. No, a default constructor does exist for Sun. That's what I hate about these error lists. Sometimes it's showing you errors that don't really exist. It's not updated dynamically like it should be. Okay. Amazing how long it takes these fucking programs to start up. But at any rate, you know, so that works pretty much the same way. But see, now that I've set it back, you know, again, you know, I set the Sun's constructor back to being like it originally was. So now when I call this 2-parameter version of the constructor for the grandson, you know, now it's calling, you know, the Sun's constructor, it's overloaded constructor, and that by default, because of how it was defined in the Sun class, you know, calls the parent's constructor. So that gives me indirectly what I was trying to accomplish. So, you know, we're calling the grandson's overload 2 function constructor, and then we're calling the Sun's overloaded constructor, and then finally the parent's overloaded constructor. But that's the only way to do it, you know, because there's no other way. You can't go do it directly like I was trying to do in this version 3 constructor for the grandson, you know. That's why it just still calls the default constructors. And like I said before, I defined a default constructor, like I think I showed you, for the Sun. You know, you couldn't even do that. I mean, because it, you know, you could only call the you know, the overloaded constructor here because it didn't have a default constructor in that chain, so I couldn't just like set up a constructor here because, you know, it would you know, kind of encounter problems. It's still trying to tell me that no default constructor exists for Sun, a piece of shit. But at any rate, you know, that's what I'm saying. This fucking goddamn programming IDE of theirs, you know, really sucks. It's got some goddamn bugs in it, big time. You know, telling you shit like this is absolutely not true. There are no errors in it.